All right, we are slowing down in the waiting room a little bit, so I think Elizabeth, we can go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar to talk about the VOCA funding. We've been talking about VOCA funding for quite a while and about the volatility of it and concerns that we've had that are coming from our funder, OVC in Washington. We've been talking with you guys about it. And so recently we gave this information that we're about to present to you to the Advisory Council, and we found that it really provided a lot of context and clarity surrounding where VOCA funding comes from, how it works, and how it goes from OVC through us to you. And so because we are trying to be as collaborative and transparent as possible and make sure that you have all the most up-to-date information, we thought that this would be a good topic to present to you. And we want to make sure that, whatever you choose to do in when you get this information, we want to make sure that everybody has the same information, that it's consistent, that it's accurate, and that, we're telling you everything that we know so that we can plan and you can plan accordingly. As with anything, we don't have a crystal ball, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, but we want you to know what we know. And some of you may know what we know already, or more, but we want to make sure that we are getting the same message out to everybody. So what we're going to talk about today is, the Crime Victim Fund, through which we get that federal funding, is inherently volatile. It changes from year to year. The cap is different year to year, and it makes it really challenging for states to have to figure out, how they're going to get this money out to the programs. And so we're going to have Melinda talk about how dramatically the VOCA victim assistance funding fluctuates from year to year. It's not the most sustainable funding, and it makes it really challenging for all of us to have to operate within the parameters of this. The thing too is that there's always been misconceptions, and maybe not among you, but it's worth mentioning that we get two pots of money from OVC. One is for compensation and one is for victim assistance. And the victim assistance part of it is where we get the most amount of funding, or the largest pot of money, and we get a separate allocation for the compensation. So it's good to know, because when there are increases in compensation claims, that is primarily a state-funded program, as opposed to a federally funded program. And because the feds also restrict a lot of what we can use funding for, and we don't get as much state funding as sometimes we need, then it can create problems in terms of are looking to expand compensation. But anyway, we're really talking about mostly about victim assistance here. So as many of you know, in 2021, I think it was in July, the president signed what we call the VOCA fix. And I think that the use of the term fix is a bit of a misnomer, because it didn't fix the problem. It helped expand the resources that can be utilized to go into the Crime Victim Fund. But as you'll hear a little bit more when Melinda starts going through the slides, it didn't fix the problem of diminishing funds. And as we've talked about before with you guys, a lot of this is simple math, that if there's not money going in, but there's money going out, that there's going to be a diminishment in the fund. And that is what we've experienced. And so what Congress was trying to do was to plug a hole, essentially, by increasing what monies would be going into the fund. So, for example, it used to be just fines and fees from criminal convictions. But as we found out, a lot of what corporations, for example, pay when they are caught doing something naughty are not criminal convictions. And so any fines or fees that emanated from that, for example, a deferred prosecution or a non-prosecution agreement, which is used pretty regularly by the U.S. Attorney's Office, none of that money was going into the fund. So when you would see in the paper, you'd read about X corporation paying hundreds of millions of dollars, that money was not going into the fund. So now that has been rectified, which is a really important step. And, you know, hopefully that in the future, that will really help to shore up the fund. But right now it is slow to do that. So I'd say that it's making a difference, but it's not making a big enough difference, at least in the short term. And, you know, we obviously want to keep the field working at capacity. We want to make sure that you're not losing staff, that you're avoiding burnout among staff, and that we continue to innovate, that we don't become stagnant because we don't have the money to do things that really will advance the field and make a difference for victims of crime. So the director of OVC has really gone to great lengths to try to provide regular updates to state administrators about VOCA funding. At the VOCA conference this summer, even Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois spoke and said, you know, he recognizes that the VOCA fix wasn't a fix. And so they are attempting to move in a positive direction of finding alternative sources for the Crime Victim Fund, at least in the short term. And by short term, I'm thinking maybe, you know, 2 or 3 years. We don't know what we don't know, but those are things that we're hearing. And so we're going to continue to share whatever information we get with you. And I know that it's distressing and it creates anxiety when none of us have a concrete answer about what's going to happen. But, you know, we're trying to be as collaborative with you as possible so that we can help at least alleviate some of that anxiety. We feel like, you know, we're a team, we're all in this together. We're going to continue to advocate for your clients, for your programs, for our office, because when you experience a downturn, we do too. And so we want to make sure that we're all operating to the fullest extent as possible. So what we're going to do today is I have Lauren Cesny, who many of you know. She is our community outreach person. So a lot of you have been working with her. And also Melinda Williams is here. She's our acting director of operations, who's going to provide information with the slides plus a lot of context. I also have Katie Englefield, who's the Deputy Director for Compensation, if you have any questions. So feel free to put questions in the chat, and, you know, feel free to raise your hand so that we can answer your questions and give you the most helpful and accurate information. Lauren?
All right. I know Elizabeth just introduced you, Melinda, but do you want to do a quick hello before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to be here with you. My name is Melinda Williams. As Elizabeth said, I'm currently the acting deputy director overseeing our grants unit, which manages contracts with our funded programs, and also our administrative services unit, which handles admin and finance functions for the agency. And we also have involvement with our training and outreach team, which is bringing you this webinar today. So we're happy to be here. We've got a lot of content, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So happy to be here. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Melinda. Do you want to start sharing the slides while I introduce myself? All right, so we have a very large group today. I assume that you have all seen my face before, but for those of you that haven't or that don't know me, I'm Lauren Cesny. I have worked at OVS for a little over 4 years now, and I work in our training and outreach unit as our community engagement liaison. A big part of my role is to have meaningful conversations with all of you and to bring your voices to the decision-making table here at OVS. So I kind of like to say I'm an advocate for the advocates. But with that being said, in order to have the best conversations with all of you in a meaningful way, I think it's really important for all of us to have access to the same information, and not only the same information, but I think it's important that we share the context and the history and everything behind that information in a way that's easy for all of you to understand, because I know that you don't eat, sleep, and breathe VOCA the way OVS does. And quite frankly, it's not your job to do that. You have a more important job. And we don't want to make you think that VOCA is your one and only job. You have more important things to do. So it's our job to give you that information in a way that's digestible and easy to consume. I found that we've been really good at sharing information and numbers over the years, but it can get lost in the shuffle when you have a lot of increases and decreases and percentages and dollar values and changes, and it's really easy to get confused or lost in the shuffle. So I hope that by today we can share a little bit of that context around everything that's happening with VOCA and OVS funding. So I hope that we can answer some of your questions today and share some context. Before we actually get started, I can hear OVS staff in the back of my head saying you are not allowed to lobby with your VOCA funding. You can do whatever you want outside of VOCA funding. But if you are funded with other grants, you should probably check with your contract managers for other agencies as well. But in your free time, you can do whatever you want. In addition to that, we are sharing the most up-to-date information that we have. So if there's anything that you want to do with this information, if there's numbers that you're trying to share, if you need any clarifications on what you intend to share, and you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We can't tell you what to say, but we can clarify whatever you need. And I've already had a few people ask some questions from the last time we did this presentation, and we've gotten a lot of good clarification and good discussions from that. So we are available anytime, even before, during, or I guess not before, but during or after today's presentation. So I know Blake put in the chat that there is closed captioning available via Zoom. We don't have a captioner, but it is available to turn on through the Zoom function. And if you have any questions, we'll be pausing throughout to answer questions. And we also have a handful of questions that we received before today's presentation. So we'll go through as much as we can. We'll answer questions throughout, and we'll also answer questions at the end. All right, let's get started. So I'm gonna take care of a few of the high level stuff and a little bit of how the funding works. And then I'm gonna pass it off to Melinda to get us into the details and all the numbers. So she knows everything. So if you really want to get deep into the weeds, she will take us there. But to get started, I'll go through some high level stuff about where the funding for OVS comes from, how it all works, and then we'll get into some of the updated numbers and the Crime Victims Fund and some discussion. So OVS has 4 main sources of funding that makes its way out to all of you in the form of grants or in the form of victim compensation. So we get 2 sources of federal funding, and at this moment we have 2 sources of state funding. So for federal funding, we receive VOCA victim compensation and also VOCA victim assistance. They are 2 separate streams of funding, 2 separate pots. They come from the same place. They're both VOCA, but they are 2 separate sources of funding, and we cannot mix them. Every state does has it a little bit differently. Some states have separate agencies for victim assistance and a separate agency for victim compensation. New York and a handful of other states have it in the same place. And then for state funding, we have our Criminal Justice Improvement Account, also known as CJIA. And that is kind of like a state version of VOCA, and we'll get into what that means in a little bit. And then we also have a CJIA general fund transfer for the duration of the 2022 RFA contracts. And Melinda will also get into more details of all of that. So the federal funding that OVS receives, both VOCA victim assistance and VOCA victim compensation, comes from the same place. It comes from the Crime Victims Fund. And as you know, the Crime Victims Fund is made up of deposits from the Department of Justice when they go after corporations and companies that are causing any problems. So corporate malfeasors or wrongdoers or federal level cases that will go into that Crime Victims Fund. From there, the Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, which is essentially a federal version of OVS, they are in charge of dispersing the balances of the Crime Victims Fund. And I do just want to mention, sometimes we use the term Crime Victims Fund and VOCA interchangeably. So if you have questions about what that means or clarifications, please just jump in the chat and we're happy to clarify. So after the Department of Justice collects that money and puts it into the Crime Victims Fund, there's a subdivision or department within the DOJ called OVC, and they are in charge of dispersing to all of their obligations and allocations. And I'm going to get into those details on the next slide, but they're in charge of getting that money to where it needs to go. And then from there, when it makes its way to New York State and all the other states, the state administering agency in New York, it's OVS, we are in charge of getting that money out the door in the form of grants and in the form of compensation. And we're also, we have to ensure that we're following all the federal rules and regulations, but also all the state rules and regulations as it relates to spending and getting money out there. Next slide, please.
Lauren, before you transition, we have a quick question about what is VOCA.
So VOCA is the Violence Against Women Act, and sometimes it comes out of the Crime Victims Fund, and sometimes it doesn't. It varies from year to year.
It's administered by the Division of Criminal Justice Services. Also, to clarify, it's not administered by OVS.
And I see we have a hand raised. If you could put your question in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll get started on the next slide. So in the last slide, step 2, where OVC is in charge of all of the dispersing of the funding, this is a breakdown of that step 2. So where it all starts is Congress every year sets the annual funding cap. When I first started at OVS, I was very confused about what the funding cap meant. So in the event that anyone is like me and had no idea what that meant, the funding cap is what is allowed to come out of the Crime Victims Fund. It's not a balance, it's not anything like that. It's just what is allowed to come out every year. We have a slide later on that shows you visually where the caps have been over the years. But ideally, the funding cap is lower than the balance so that there is enough funding to actually pay all of these things I'm about to get into. But you'll see later on it's a little bit rocky right now. So after that funding cap is established, we then have a handful of obligations and transfers and fees and set-asides. I'm not going to go into details about all of these because there's a lot of them, but we are going to be sharing the slides. So there's a link at the bottom here where you can find more information. So they have some obligations for VOCA, for the Inspector General, for FBI Witness Specialists, for Tribal Victim Services. They have some fees, they have some discretionary grants that they do. Most of these do have percentages or a certain amount. Some don't, but it is kind of formula based for some of these, but not all. From there, after they fulfill all of these obligations, anything that's left over is then used for formula grants. And they come out in a very specific order with a very specific formula. The VOCA victim compensation formula grants are based on a form. I know I keep saying we're going to get into this later. I promise we will. But it's formula based, and it's based on 47.5% of the remaining balance after all of those obligations. So after that, the very last thing to come out is the victim assistance formula grant. So when we say victim assistance, that's what you all see in the form of grants. And that comes from 47.5% of the remaining balance after those other things with the compensation and the obligations. So because the VOCA victim assistance grants come out last, they're usually subject to the most fluctuation, just because of the nature of how the formulas and the process works. All right, so I'm going back to this slide just for a moment, just to level set and remind you where we're at. So we have the two sources of federal funding. We have victim assistance, VOCA victim assistance, VOCA victim compensation. We use those to get money out the door in the form of grants and compensation. We use state funding to supplement the federal funding that we get out there. So we combine things and we get it out the door, and Melinda's going to talk about all of those combinations and dollar values and where it all comes from. But in a nutshell, these are the primary sources of funding that the field sees from OVS. So I'm going to pause for a minute before handing it off to Melinda. Blake, are there any questions or comments in the chat? And if you have any questions about any of this before we move on, feel free to ask them now.
We do have two real quick. First one is, I think this is just most recently based on your current slide, would be helpful for us to just clarify the difference between crime victims assistance and compensation. High level, what are the two main differences?
You want me to take that, Lauren? Okay, so at a very high level, the victim compensation funding, that's what's going out as direct payments to victims of crime, their families, providers. So that's what people are actually applying to OVS for benefits and payments that are going out. The victim assistance funding is what we use to fund our community-based organizations. So that's really what's supporting our contracts with victim assistance programs across the state. That's funding the staff and operations of actual programs across the state.
Thank you. And then we had a question in the chat earlier that was asking, are we able to get involved in the Fair Access to Victim Compensation Coalition and advocacy efforts as OVS funded staff?
So Lauren touched on this earlier, but there are restrictions on lobbying using our federal dollars, and that's pretty firmly set out by the federal government. So the short answer is no. If it's really strictly lobbying efforts, it should not be done during OVS funded time. If you as an individual have a portion of your time that's not OVS funded, or if there's activities you want to engage in, on personal time that's not on official OVS funded time, that's a different story. Particularly if it's lobbying, if there's a call to action, if there's a specific request. There are times when some activities could just be educational or information sharing, and that might be a different story. But if you're talking about specific advocacy efforts, the short answer is no, that's not allowable under our federal dollars.
All right,
That's all
anything
we
else?
have right now.
Good, okay. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to Melinda now to take us into the weeds.
Okay. I don't know if I can deliver on knowing everything, but we do have a lot of detail for you guys. And as we mentioned, if there are follow-up questions or things that you want to get into more, I'm always happy to follow up afterwards or on the side also. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually use each source of funding. And this first section focuses on the victim compensation side. So as I mentioned earlier, this is more the direct payments that are going out to victims of crime and their families, and sometimes directly to providers. As Lauren mentioned a little bit earlier, the main sources of funding that support our victim compensation payments are the VOCA federal victim compensation dollars and also the CGIA. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the federal piece. So when we get our victim compensation funding each year, we can use up to 5% of it for our own administration expenses. So this supports things like crime victim specialist staff that are actually processing claims and interacting with claimants. We also use a small portion for operational expenses of the agency. It's not a huge amount, so really the bulk of our operational costs are funded through CGIA, but we do have a portion here that we use. And our award amount each year is formula driven, so it's actually based on 75% of what we spent 2 years prior on state spending. So this leads to some complicated math for us because we have to maintain a certain level of state spending to make sure that our federal awards don't go down. And sometimes if we get a really, really big federal award, it actually is more challenging. We want to make sure we don't only use that and then we don't do state spending, because then we have a lot of fluctuations in the awards. So ideally, we would like to see a mostly stable value in our federal awards so we can manage and plan around that unless there's anything really driving an increase in claims. But our administrative team here does some management of that in terms of the timing of when we use different funds and making sure that we're doing what we can to maximize federal resources. So every year we have to submit what's called the VOCA Victim Compensation Certification Form. This is basically we report our spending on the state level. There are some things that have to be netted out and calculated, but that's how we formally report what we spend. And then they'll use that 2 years down the road to calculate our next award. We typically find out in the spring what our award is going to be, but in this case, because this one is formula driven, we usually know before then. It's not a big surprise when we get our allocations. We have this little graphic here to just kind of, again, show that 2-year time frame. So the first circle shows spending, our certified state spending in federal fiscal year 21. So again, this is only state portion. That's not total victim compensation spending, but this is what we reported in that form. And then that translates to our FFY 23 victim comp award of 10.8 million, because that is 75% of that value. And then the circles on the bottom just show the overlapping the next 2-year cycle, which is taking place, which is that we have to certify for FFY 2022, and then that will ultimately inform our 24 award. So we're always in that 2-year cycle, reporting the information to the federal government, and that dictates what our victim compensation award amounts will be. This chart here just shows some of the recent victim compensation awards that we've gotten, and you'll see there are some changes. I would again say here, though, these changes are not so much based on any kind of claim trends for the most part. It's very largely based on administrative timing of when we use different state funds versus federal funds and how much we end up reporting. Ideally, we would like to see it a little bit more stable, and that's something that we're working on going forward. But this just gives you a little bit of picture. Typically, the federal award is somewhere around 9 million or so, but it can vary between, 11 and even a little bit lower, like 8 or so. So we have some variation, but generally in the same ballpark from year to year. Okay, so now to talk a little bit about the CGIA portion that supports our victim compensation funding. So there's a few technical references here, but we wanted to give a little information. This is a special revenue fund. So it's set up in state law, and there's designated fines and fees that go into this fund. OVS does not actually collect or process any of these fees. We just have access to the fund to use what's in there to make victim compensation payments, support our operations, and some other expenses. For the most part, the fines that are referenced here are things like the mandatory surcharge on certain criminal offenses. There's a supplemental sex offender fee. There's some DMV fees. So depending on, if you have gotten traffic infractions, depending on where that happened, you might have paid into the CGIA. And again, those are processed through the DMV. So we kind of have access to the fund. We can see what's in there, but we aren't really driving what gets deposited in there. And the fines and fees range from about $5 to $1,000. Certain offenses have multiple fees, but that's just something that we keep an eye on in terms of available balance. Okay, and this chart here shows a little bit of a graphic of what's happened with the fund balance. So the available dollars that we have in this fund to use, they really went down during the pandemic. We saw a really big decrease in both the revenue that's being collected annually, and then also kind of the average amount that was in the fund at any one time to be able to be used. So we saw it really go down. It hasn't quite recovered. We keep a very close eye on revenue trends. But this is something that has been concerning to us in the past, just because it's definitely not in the healthy shape that it once was pre-pandemic. We also keep an eye on legislative initiatives that might impact fines and fees in the criminal justice realm. There's, I think, lots of great proposals and policy initiatives to take a look at those, but ultimately any changes there do have an impact on resources that are available for OVS to conduct our operations and to pay claimants. So that's something that we also are always keeping an eye on during legislative sessions.
We do have a couple, before we transition to victim assistance, a couple of questions. This first one is, why do the feds give 25% less each year? I think this is referencing the 75-25 split.
So I don't see it as they're giving 25% less. I think it's just, that's how the formula is based. They want to incentivize states to also be supporting the victim compensation program, so it's not only supported with federal dollars. And actually, if anything, the formula has gone up. When I started with OVS, the formula was 60% of the spending 2 years prior, and now it is 75%. So they have actually made the formula more generous. And yeah, I think it's just kind of the way they do it. They want to incentivize the state support also and to keep that. So it's not just supplanting state spending on it only.
Melinda, do you want to go back to that slide really quick?
Sure. Do you want this one?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's generally how the formula works. And the change to the 75%, I believe, took effect in with the FY23 award. So the years prior to this graphic would have been the 60% calculation.
And a couple other similar questions. They're asking for we've been asked for clarification on the awards based on 75% of state spending on compensation 2 years prior. So essentially, does this mean that awards are based on how many crime victims applications we received and how many of those are awarded compensation?
To some extent, yes. I don't think that the math is always that simple because, the number of claims we receive, also like the types of claims, we have ongoing medical expenses that we pay for some claims that were awarded some time ago that may still have continuing medical expenses. So there's a lot of moving pieces that go into what we spend. But in a sense, yes, the federal award is based on what's happening with claims activity in New York State, but it is also dependent, as I mentioned earlier, on some timing decisions that we make as well in terms of what time of year we use state funds, what time of year we use federal funds. When there's an expansion at the state level in terms of caps, of dollar value caps that we will pay for certain items or other legislative changes, that also impacts our spending too. So it's not as simple of a math as if claims go up, our spending goes up, and the federal award goes up. There's a lot that really goes into the calculations.
And someone also had a follow-up question that basically more, and again, we're talking about compensation, not necessarily victim assistance, but more compensation applications would make more money come in. Yes or no? It's kind of a gray
Yeah,
area?
it's a similar question. I think one thing I would note is, as in theory, if we saw a really big increase in compensation spending, so if there are very big changes to our compensation program and a very big increase in claims, and if you saw that in New York and other states as well, that there could be less balance available to go into the victim assistance awards that fund our contracts with funded programs. Just one state might not be driving that so much, but it is because the compensation spending and calculation happens first and then victim assistance, it is related in that sense. If you saw a really big spike in compensation spending, that might have down the road implications for victim assistance funding.
I think that's it for questions right now. Again, thank you, everyone. Keep them coming. We hope and encourage you to engage with us as much as possible throughout the webinar.
Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use our funding on the victim assistance side. So again, this is the funding that goes to support our contracts with community-based programs across the state. And so those contracts are supported with our federal VOCA victim assistance dollars. And then also, we touched on this very briefly before, but we do have some state support on the current contracts, which comes through the CGIA and general fund. Talk about that a little bit next. On the federal side, again, we can use 5% of our award for administration, and this primarily funds our contract management staff in the grants unit. Those are the monitors of our contracts. They're reviewing reimbursement requests and setting up contract budgets and things like that. We also apply in the spring. This one is not formula-based for us, so for the most part, we're just submitting documentation about our program. And the award amounts are based on, what is the available balance, what is the cap that's set by Congress, and then it is distributed to states based on population. So this one we don't have as much influence in what this is going to be. We just are kind of notified of what our award allocation will be in the spring based on that process. This graph here shows the fluctuations, and you'll see it's a much different picture than victim compensation. Prior to this graph, before 2015, our awards were pretty stable for a while at around 25 million or so. And then starting in 2015, we saw some very big increases. You'll see that first bar there says 343% increase, which was great, but also was challenging for us because we had to staff up. We had to figure out how to get the funding out. The state procurement process is very slow. So we had a few years of very big awards, and we had to adjust to that new reality. The highest year was 2018, when we actually had a $199 million award. And then since then, for the most part, we've seen big decreases. And this is what's really hard for us to manage, because we do multi-year awards. We have a lengthy procurement process. So when things go up and down by such big variations, it's very hard for us to plan and to coordinate getting the funding out in the best way possible. So in 2022, it went back up a little bit, but since then we've seen decreases. We don't know yet the final number for 2024. We'll find that out in the spring. But based on available info we have so far, we think it's going to be another big decrease, probably somewhere in the low 40 million range. And that's a very big change from the high that we had in 2018. You'll also see the little gray bar that says GKH addition. That stands for Governor Kathy Hochul, and that is the state funds that we will talk about next. So a couple years ago, we received 14.4 million annually from the state. And so this is actually set up as a transfer from the general fund to the CGIA, which is technical, but really what it means is if you're looking at budget documents, you're not going to see it lined out. So we had some questions last year about what happened to it. It's not in the budget anymore, but it's not lined out in the way a typical budget allocation would be from the state. So it is general fund money. It is transferred annually into the CGIA, and we built these amounts into the 2022 RFA awards that already went out. The purpose of this funding was to keep overall resources in our last RFA flat compared to the most recent funding cycle. So this is another thing we get questions on a lot, because individual awards might have gone up or down. It's still a competitive process. So everyone who applied may have applied for different things and different amounts, and they may have scored differently during the review process. So individual awards may have changed, but the overall amount of funding was kept flat with this 14.4 million per year. And we do have it for 3 years, so through the 2022 RFA. And that was really great support that we got from the state, and it's been helpful to have those amounts included. So both of those funding sources go into our victim assistance program contracts, and our funding cycle is, as I mentioned, a 3-year cycle. So we released our last RFA, request for applications, in early 2022, and those contracts started 10/1/2022. We're funding through September 30th, 2025. So our expectation is we would release a new RFA in early 2025 to fund the next cycle. So this graph again just shows the history of the awards, and we wanted to overlay a little bit of graphic to show you how we use these awards to support our different procurements. So I'm just going to put them all on there. So we combine multiple years to support each RFA, and it's a little confusing, but basically, because we're funding a multi-year cycle and because the awards have kind of changed a lot, we have to combine multiple years to put out the same level of funding. So the first light gray box that you see was our case manager solicitation that we did a few years ago that funded case manager staff at funded programs. The middle boxes, the yellow and the darker gray or blue, that was our attorney solicitation and our 2019 RFA. And then the final box shows what we used for our most recent 2022 RFA. So I think sometimes there's confusion, if one single award goes up or down, that doesn't necessarily impact the entire RFA because we're using multiple years and we have a bit of a complicated planning process. But you will notice as the awards have gotten smaller, we've had to use more of the awards at once together to support the RFA. So a few years ago, we were using, 2 or 3 awards to support something. In the most recent RFA, we've had to use 5 awards plus the state dollars. The other thing that this means is we're now really living in our current award. So previously, because the awards were so big, and because we had a bit of time, there was a little bit of cushion. If things decreased down the road, we had time to figure it out, to try and move things around. Now we don't have that slack. The awards are down. We're using them pretty quickly as soon as we receive them. So whatever cuts we get in 2024, if there's additional reductions in 2025, that's going to impact whatever awards we have out at that time. We don't really have any more timing cushion because they've gone down and we're using them so quickly. Okay, I'll pause there. Are there questions, Blake, on that section?
Yeah, we actually have a couple ones first. So somebody actually earlier asked what percentage of funds distributed through the 22 RFA are state versus federal, and you just showed in the infographic what that is. But actual percentage wise, I'm not sure. I think it ends up being like 85 federal, 15 state, somewhere in there. Does that seem about right?
For the 2022 RFA?
Correct.
Yeah, I can't do the mental math on the spot. Yes, but so each year is about 110 million in federal resources and then the 14.4 million in state resources.
Okay. We had a question about why we combine awards and not just issue annual grants every year.
I think a lot of that is the time. There's a few answers for that. One is the timing of the procurement process. It takes us so long to get through the RFA to begin with that if we were doing annual awards, we would just kind of constantly be doing it. And some of that is OVS, but a lot of that is just the state finance law in terms of steps we have to go through and review and approval by OSC. And it's very lengthy. So
for programs, you have to apply every year, I would think.
Yes. So it would be administratively difficult for OVS, but also for the programs. You guys would have to be applying every year, putting together documentation. You also wouldn't have as much certainty about your funding. So currently we provide the funding for a 3-year time period. And if we were just doing annual awards, you would have less information about what your funding would be going forward. And I think that would be challenging on the program level as well.
Okay, we do have 2 compensation questions, but I think I'm going to save those for after the Crime Victims Fund Balance one. But we also have 2 other additional VA related ones. How many programs were funded in 2015 versus the 20, which would, I think you mean the 22 RFA?
Yeah, I don't have those numbers in front of me right now. There were some new programs. I want to say around 19 or so new programs in the 2022 RFA that were not funded in the 2019 RFA. Sometimes we have funded those programs previously under another solicitation, but they might have just not done all of the funding in a row. So we do get new programs periodically. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me though.
And then a specific question relative to CASA. I believe that is court appointed special advocates for children, and somebody is interested in what percentage of OVS VOCA funding goes to those programs. And again, I don't expect you to know that off the top of your head, but it's something that we can at least address.
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me, but we can follow up.
If you send us an email after the after today, we can look into it for you.
Okay. All
Okay,
right, so that's it for
one
now,
more.
Blake. Oh,
No,
go ahead.
one more. Let's take this one just because it's relevant. Is there a chance we could see a decrease in our funding for this current 3-year grant cycle, or is it more likely to be applied to the next cycle?
Okay, stay tuned because we're going to touch on that later. The very, very quick answer is there is a possibility of a small reduction to the final year 3 of the current cycle, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. It's a good question. All right, so I'm going to go a little bit next into the Crime Victims Fund at the federal level. So this is going back to where we actually get the federal dollars from the federal government. So this graph here we like a lot because this shows receipts into the federal fund. And again, this is primarily from fines and penalties, particularly some bigger ones on corporations. In the older years, we saw things like settlements against Volkswagen and Enron, things like that going in here. They went way down. And Elizabeth mentioned in her opening remarks the VOCA fix. So this was legislation passed at the federal level a couple of years ago that opened up additional revenue into the fund, these deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. Everyone was really hopeful that would be this big influx of revenue into the fund. And that is the yellow portion of the bars that you see. So it has been disappointing so far how much has actually come in. We're definitely in a better place than we would be without it, but you can see there that the most recent years are still pretty low. So there's not a lot going into the federal fund, and that really drives a lot of the funding availability that ultimately trickles down to the states. This graph also shows a different look at this. So the bars now are the end of year balance in the Crime Victims Fund at the federal level, and the yellow line is the cap. So as we mentioned earlier, that's actually the amount that's available to go out to states for both the victim assistance funding, compensation, all the set-asides and things that Lauren mentioned earlier. And so you can see for a while it was pretty flat, and the fund was getting some of those big deposits that we talked about, things like Volkswagen. So then they started increasing the cap around 2015. That's when we got bigger awards. And then as revenue wasn't coming in, the balance is going down. They've decreased the cap, but not really to the extent they might have needed to, in a sense, that they are now really depleting the fund. So where you see that the yellow line is a little bit above the blue bars, what that's indicating there is they're more than using the balance in the fund. So they're basically using current year revenue in to support funding out to the states, which is not ideal financial practice. They're basically depleting the fund every year. There's more money coming in, but not really at the pace to keep up with it. I also did want to note, we've previously shared a version of this. Some of you may have seen this presentation or received the slides a few months ago. We've updated the numbers since then, and the balance numbers are even lower. So if you have questions about that, you can always double check with us to make sure you have the most updated one, but this is most recent information that we just pulled. If you're interested in this and you want to know more about what's happening with the Crime Victims Fund at the federal level, there's a couple of things we would recommend. One is you can actually listen to monthly calls from the OVC director, Chris Rose, that's at the federal level. So every second Thursday of the month at 3 o'clock, they do a call, and she'll give updates on what's happening with the balance, anything impacting VOCA. They're pretty quick. They're also recorded and posted on the website. So we have the link in here, and you guys will get these slides. This page also has information on the fund balance and the deposits that we use to make those charts. So they do update that every month. You can see what's coming into the fund and if there's been any big changes there. Okay, I'll pause there. Do you want to do some of the chat questions first, Blake, and then we'll get into the questions we received ahead of time?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe we should revisit the question from earlier about possibility of seeing a decrease in the current 3-year grant cycle versus the following one.
Sure. So it's a question we get a lot, and I think there's been some concern about this and some confusion. So we put out our RFA hoping that the VOCA fix would have a bigger impact than it did. And so now, we're analyzing where the numbers are. We think there is a chance of reductions in year 3 of the current contracts. We're doing everything we can to minimize that. We know even small reductions are really challenging for programs. So we definitely hear you. At this time, we think the most it would be is maybe 10 to 15% reductions, but we're hopeful we'll get it down from that. We're looking to see what our final 24 award will be. That will dictate a lot of it. So we'll know more in the spring. And we're also taking a look to see if there's any underspending in years 1 and 2 of the contracts. And if so, we can roll some of that funding forward. So I'm pretty confident we'll see that number drop down, but we can't guarantee that we'll be able to, avoid any kind of reductions. We have heard some questions about, are we just canceling year 3 of the contracts? That's definitely not the case. We have funding for year 3. We're just trying to fine tune the numbers and get all the information we can to see what exactly that's going to look like.
2 crime victims fund questions. What do you think explains the big drop from 2017 to subsequent years?
In the crime victims fund?
Yes.
So that's a tough one to say, again, because we're not really processing or seeing the settlements and deposits and things like that on the federal level. I think we just haven't seen some of the very big cases and very big settlements like we used to. And it's also just maybe a shift in terms of how they're prosecuting things at the federal level. Certain types of actions by the district attorneys and people at the federal level kind of dictate what happens with a case and if there's settlements or fines and fees. And so, Elizabeth, did you want to say something on that?
Well, they just weren't paying attention to the math too. I mean, I think that's the consequence is, what we're seeing, but it's from not paying attention when you continually raise the cap, but the money's not going in. The prior administration did not do a lot of large corporate prosecutions. And so that was one of the consequences.
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. It's how the presidential administration is approaching prosecutions and kind of cases that they're taking on. But then also, to Elizabeth's point, they probably should have lowered the cap at a different rate or maybe sooner. Although that would have been difficult for the states, it would have not depleted the fund. So I think they have a difficult balance of wanting to keep resources flowing to the community, but also they're being realistic about how much funding is in there. So a couple of things there, but the timing of when they adjusted the cap and then also the types of settlements and fines and fees that are going in.
One more CVS question. If the fund is depleted, what happens? Does it lead to full congressional budget line?
It's a great question. I wish we knew exactly what would happen. We have concerns about that too. We're hopeful at the federal level they wouldn't let that happen. They would find another revenue source. So far, it hasn't been an issue because they've been able to use current year receipts, but we're also kind of watching to see what would happen there.
Okay, so these are more relative to current contract questions. I'll start with somebody who asked in the chat, is it possible to roll over any funds not spent from the current approved budget?
So if the question is asking about like a specific program's contract, we don't allow them to roll funds over like from year 1 to year 2 if there's unspent amounts. However, in my comment earlier, we are looking globally at if there's underspending and unused amounts, and then we can kind of reallocate how we're programming different award years to hopefully lessen the gap for year 3. So on an individual basis, no, but we are looking at it on a global basis to see if there's anything we can do to help mitigate reductions down the road.
What can advocates do to shore up 3-year contracts so that there's no loss in the 3rd year? What amount should they ask for from legislative supporters in order to avoid further reductions?
It's a good question. We can't really, recommend specific advocacy, and obviously we have been talking with our governor's office and our budget office to explain the issue. I think some of it also is it's a moving target because we don't know for sure what the 24 award will be. So we don't have a specific number we're putting out there. We'll definitely keep everyone updated as much as we can. And, we appreciate support, but we also can't encourage you guys to advocate for anything in particular.
Is the 10 to 15% decrease that you referenced for each program in the year 3 amounts?
Yes. So if there was a reduction, again, 10 to 15% maximum, but we're hoping to really reduce that, it would be applied across the board. So just equally to everybody, the same percentage reduction.
When would programs be told about year 3 decreases?
We'll definitely communicate as soon as we can. There's a lot of pieces of information that we don't know yet, so I don't have a definite time frame. After the spring, we'll know our next federal award, we'll know what happened with the state budget. And I would say after year 2 concludes, we'll be able to take a look at underspending. So it'll probably be, pretty close to year 3. We'll do as much as we can to communicate when we can. But if some of it is dependent on year 2 spending, we obviously have to wait till the later part of year 2. And, we'll be doing everything we can to get that analysis together and notify programs.
And of course, any potential cut leads people to question, should we be worried that we will see a drastic decrease on program funding, especially if OBS is their primary funding source?
For year 3 or just generally?
It just says in general.
So for year 3, as I said, I don't think anything drastic is on the horizon. We know even smaller reductions are really challenging for programs. The bigger concern would be the next RFA. So if there's not action, additional revenue either on the federal or state level, and if the VOCA awards continue at the same trends that we're seeing now, that would be the bigger shortfall, would be available funding that we can put out in our next RFA, and that might be a significant change.
And then a similar question about year 2 to year 3 rollovers, if we are anticipating a decrease in VOCA funds, is that possible?
So again, not on the individual contract level, but we're doing what we can administratively to reallocate or to roll things forward where we can to minimize potential reductions.
Okay. Can we give, before we answer another question, Kathy Jocelyn a quick shout out? She was able to track down some data from earlier questions. Our first question was about the number of programs from 2015 to 2022. 2015, we had 234. And in the 2022 RFA, we had 239 plus 8 additional MOAs with other state agencies. So that's not necessarily all of the individual programs, just the number of contracts. And then of the 3-year total for CASA programs, it's a less than 1%, 0.62%.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah. Oh, and then one more question here about us expecting any changes for the next grant.
So if the question is referring to our next RFA, there's still a lot up in the air because we don't know what the funding environment is going to look like. So too early to tell on that. We are going to be starting next calendar year our internal development process for the next RFA, and it would be released in early 2025. So as we have more information, we will definitely share it.
Great. Here's one last comp question from earlier that I pushed off, and it was relative to our actual compensation amounts awarded based on balances or specific to the compensation category.
So if I think I understand the question correctly, the compensation, the formula at the federal level for the compensation awards, it's based on state spending. But there is that language in there that it can't exceed a certain portion of the overall balance. So I don't think that's really been a factor in recent years, but if in theory compensation spending went through the roof across all sorts of states, that it would be limited by, it can only be a certain percentage of the balance in the crime victims fund. But for the most part, it's just dictated by state spending.
if I were interpreting that question as an actual question relative to our compensation awards for individuals, that's it. If that's the question, are those amounts that we give out based on balances in the Crime Victims Fund, or is that already predetermined?
The amounts that we actually give out in terms of compensation awards are based on our statute. So we have, certain items that are eligible for compensation. We have certain dollar value caps, and then they go through the claims review process for eligibility. So that is not necessarily determined by any types of balances or available funding. That's really based on the statute and the guiding regulations of our program. But if we're not answering your question, please follow up with us afterwards, and we can definitely explain more.
And then another question about the 10 to 15% reduction in year 3. What is, if we know the estimated dollar amount or ballpark that we might be for that overall cut?
I think that translates somewhere between like 10 and 20 million in year 3. I know this is also kind of trying to get at what is the dollar number. And I do really want to caveat that it is very much a moving target because we're still waiting for the final federal award, and because we're taking a look at overall spending. So we don't have a very precise number that we're giving out. We're still trying to sort through what exactly that'll be. It's really still an estimated range at this point.
Really good question relative to programs support. Is there anything that programs can do or can be doing on their end to ensure that OVS has everything we need for calculations for year 3?
I don't think there's anything we need specifically from the programs. I would encourage, we say this a lot, be timely in your submissions for your reimbursement requests, because the sooner we know, that a certain program has submitted all of their reimbursement requests and kind of closed out a year, that helps us to do the analysis of any underspending and what's left. We've had some programs in the past that are very delayed in submitting that information to us. And if we don't have the information, we don't have a lot to work with. So I think as an answer to that, I would just encourage as much as possible timely submission of your FCRs, your payment requests, be in regular contact with your contract manager if there's going to be delays in anything, so that we can work with that, because we'll be in a different environment that we have been, where we're very, very closely looking at spending trends in real time.
I'm gonna be mindful of our time. Is it okay to go through a couple more?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Somebody asked in the Q&A, you mentioned that underspending in years 1 and 2 will be looked at to roll over in year 3 or / current contracts. Is that correct? And does that cover all the categories of underspending?
Yeah, so this has come up in a couple of the questions, but it won't be rolled over on individual contract basis. It's really more so that we're going to take a look at, after we have all the reimbursement requests in for year 1 across the board, we're going to look at what was the underspending overall. And if some of that funding was allocated, for instance, to the 2021 award, in terms of our planning for how we're using the awards, we can shift things around a little bit and potentially cover some of year 3. So it'll be more so OVS internal planning on how we're allocating the awards. You won't really see rollover or any direct impact on your individual contract. It'll just be part of the overall math and planning for how we have things allocated against our federal awards.
Another one relative to the comp, I believe what's being asked here is, do we, as in New York State, usually use up our entire compensation grant? And if we know, what percentage of our compensation grant goes out the door to crime victims?
We do. We fully use our federal awards. The way that they are awarded to us, we have the year of the award plus 3 years to use them. So we typically, for compensation, we typically use it within a couple of years. So because our spending is so high on compensation, we spend more in state dollars than we do in federal dollars. So we more than use the federal awards.
I think that's it. We just got one in. When you indicate by timely in submissions for reimbursement requests, is the year the spending is tied to based on when the request is submitted or when the crime incident occurred?
So for those timely requests, we're really talking about the victim assistance side, not the victim compensation side. So it's not tied to specific crimes. This is more the reimbursement requests related to our funded contracts supporting programs. And the year that I'm referring to is the contract year. So for instance, the year 1 was 10/1. 2022 through 9/30/2023, and then programs have, I believe, 45 days after the end of the year to submit their reimbursement request to us. Might be slightly different for the last quarter. So there's a little bit of a lag in terms of when the actual time period ends and when we need the FCR and the payment reimbursement request. So that's the year I'm referring to. So once that has closed out, we've gotten all 4 quarters of requests. We've reviewed for eligibility. We've actually paid out what's allowable. Then we can have a picture of what was spent for year 1 for that program and what, if anything, was the remaining amount.
I think that's it for now. We can move to the next slide, but also shout out to Melinda for being quick to response and for having honest, open, and accurate responses.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I know we got some questions ahead of time. This also, before we get there, this was just, we've honestly mostly touched on this already, but we wanted to give a little bit of info about year 3 and the next RFA, and I think we've already talked about that a lot, but if there are more questions, let me know. The other thing we wanted to mention is we are seeing some other states have had state resources provided. So that is something we're definitely watching. But another thing to note is a lot of states have already seen really big cuts. New York State, because of the way our procurement process goes and because of our multi-year awards, we've been able to delay this to some extent. A lot of other states we've seen in the past year or two have already done things like 40% reductions year over year. And they've already seen those really big cuts. So this has been on our radar. We've been trying to do what we can to maximize our federal dollars and to, hold off the reductions. But now, because of the timing, like I said earlier, when we're using the awards, we're kind of in it now. So, going forward for the next RFA, we'll have to deal with that challenge. But I think we've covered everything else here. So if that's all right, Blake, I'll move on to the preset questions. Do you want
Okay, so yeah, I'll read from again, we're going to questions that were submitted to us when you registered and in leading up to today's webinar. Did the most recent VOCA audit of OVS affect the amount of funding New York State received from the federal government?
The answer is no. We've had 2 recent federal audits, which have been fun, of our compensation program and then our victim assistance program. We did not have any significant findings in terms of our spending. We have had some mostly procedural recommendations. So no, both because the audits went pretty well, and also that's not a factor that ties into the calculation process at all. So the audits have not affected our funding in any way.
Okay. How does OVS handle designated sexual assault and domestic violence funding?
The answer to this one is that we don't have those streams as designated separate funding streams. We are required by the federal government to set it to have at least 10% of our VOCA funding go to priority categories, which is domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and underserved. And we make sure those are fulfilled through the RFA process. So we, most recently have had a process where if applications that we received and ultimately awards, if we were not meeting those 10% priority categories, we have a weighting process that would adjust the awards that we did. But I don't believe we've had to use that in the recent RFAs. We've been able to meet the priority categories just based on applications and awards. That is something that the federal government does audit. We do have to report on the priority categories, so it's definitely important to how we structure our funding, but we don't have separate pots of funding. It all comes through the RFA.
If there are cuts to assistance, will there also be comparable cuts to compensation funding?
So the answer to this is no, not necessarily. As Lauren mentioned earlier, the victim assistance side of things usually sees the most fluctuations. It's the last one that comes out of the fund. But they are calculated separately. So just because there may be reductions to victim assistance, that doesn't necessarily mean there would also be reductions to victim compensation. That's calculated before that and separately. And on an individual statewide basis, if we do have to end up doing reductions to any of our funded programs, it does not impact our ability to keep paying out victim compensation payments to claimants. So they are kind of adjacent, but not directly tied in the sense that one being reduced means the other is reduced. Okay, this one we touched on.
Is OVS, yeah, we get this a lot. Is OVS canceling year 3 of our current contracts?
No, we are not canceling them. If anybody has concerns about that, you can always reach out, but no, we're not planning on canceling the year 3 contracts.
We answered this earlier too, but when will we know more about possible reductions in year 3 of our current contracts?
So we'll definitely have more information in spring. I don't know if we'll have the final answer then, but we'll at least know if the picture is looking any better or if it's still kind of status quo in terms of our concerns about year 3. And then I think as we get towards the end or the later part of year 2, we'll have more definite information about what we're doing. And we definitely want to be as transparent as we can. So as soon as we have any decisions or final numbers on this, we'll definitely be communicating that out to the programs.
And then lastly, when will we know more about the outlook of funding opportunities beyond year 3 of our contracts?
So this one, again, stay tuned for our next RFA, which will be released in early 2025. Once we start our internal planning process for the next RFA, we really can't discuss too much specifics because we'll be in a restricted procurement period. But we're definitely analyzing the numbers. We'll give information we can, and the actual document itself, which will have any kind of parameters or changes from the prior one, will be available in early 2025. Okay, I think that's it for me. Lauren, do you want to just do a little bit of wrap up?
Sure. We do have about 16 minutes left. So if you still have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. We are looking at both of them. I do just want to mention those question slides that we just went through. Those were all questions that we received during the registration process, and it was just a handful of them. We got a lot of questions that were specific to allowability questions. So if you have those types of questions, please reach out to your contract manager, or feel free to, you can reach out to OVS Outreach on this slide here, and we're happy to field any questions or get them to the right place. Blake, are there any more questions in the chat or the Q&A?
2 more I think we can address. I'm not sure off the top of our head or if anyone on can answer, but does any of the VOCA funds we have help fund sexual assault response teams for the START programs?
I'd have to follow up if there's specific programs that they're asking about. So let's follow up on that one. I don't know if I have the answer right now.
Sounds good. And then another question relative to underspending is, if we underspend our year 2 contracts for whatever reason, will that specifically impact our potential cut for year 3?
Nope. So if there's underspending in year 2 on an individual basis, that does not affect you year 3 on an individual basis. As I mentioned, we're going to look at it overall, but then any reductions are required to be applied, uniformly across the board. So we won't be treating any programs differently because of their level of underspending or things like that.
I'm not sure about this last question in here is, can previous RFAs be sent regarding DV and SA as we anticipate the 25 RFA? I mean, I guess if you're asking, can we have access to what the previous RFAs look like, that is all still online, correct?
I believe the previous RFAs are available on our website. And if you can't find them or you have specific questions, please reach out. I did want to mention too, if you have, I know we got some questions before this that were a bit specific to certain contracts or certain programs. And so we didn't necessarily include everything in the preset Q&A here. Some of those questions, I think the best approach is to reach out to your specific contract manager. If you're not sure who it is, let us know and we can connect you. But they're really your best resource for specific questions about allowability or any of the nuances of your contract.
I think Kathy has an answer for this, but if contracts are reduced, will our PMT goals be reduced accordingly?
Yeah, I can answer that one.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So PMT, we changed it to anticipated services, and with the reduction in funding that's potentially happening, we would definitely work with you to change those goals or anticipated services to better suit your funding. So yes, they are. We can alter them for you. But hopefully that
I would say too, like, we're not penalizing programs if they don't meet the anticipated services. It's more so to get a picture of what your program is intending to do. And then we also use it for reasonableness checks when we review PMT data, things like that. If you had 0 reported anticipated kind of elder abuse cases and all of a sudden you're reporting 200 of them, you know, we might follow up to say, hey, this doesn't exactly match what your anticipated data was. Is there a reason for it? Is it a mistake? So it's the goals and the anticipated services now, as we're referring to them, they're really not hard numbers that we're holding anyone to or penalizing in any way. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. It's really informational.
Not sure if we can answer this or not, but there's a question about what, if any, effort is being done to cover compensation in contracts, for example, COLAs.
So the awards year to year are flat, but the programs have the ability, you know, from within year to year to kind of move things around within the overall amount. So I think we definitely see programs building in COLAs and changes like that within their overall budget. It's really at the discretion of the program how you want to manage that and how you want to build that into your budget. But this 3-year cycle was awarded at a flat overall amount year to year.
I'm not seeing any other questions.
All
Maybe
right.
Give it one more minute, yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit, but if more questions come in, we will answer them. We still do have plenty of time for more questions if you have more. So we shared a lot of information today, and like I said earlier, if you have any questions about this information or you have information you want to share, definitely in your free volunteer time and not on VOCA funded time. If you have any questions about confirming that information, confirming the accuracy, or helping clarify things, we're happy to look at it and let you know if it's accurate or up to date or not. We just can't tell you what to say. So please feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to look and confirm accuracy of things for you. We're happy to help with that. This presentation is being recorded, so we will be publishing that on our OVS YouTube channel. It does take a couple days for Zoom to do the download, upload, whatever. I'm not good at Zoom, so I just pretend I am. So we will get that on our YouTube channel as soon as possible, and we will be sending an update to all attendees when that's available. We'll also be sharing the slides, and we'll also be sending out an evaluation survey. Please complete those, because I personally really like doing this webinar, and if we get some good feedback from all of you, maybe this is something that we can do on a more regular basis to share updates. So please go ahead and fill those out. If you have any questions about any of this, please reach out to either your contract manager, or if you don't have a contract or you don't know who it is, you can always reach out to myself or OVS Outreach at ovs.ny.gov.
We do see one more question. Is there any way of getting more funding based on an increase of elder abuse victims we are servicing? Or in general, any increase in victimization, does that impact funding?
So for an individual contract, no, I mean, we award the values for a 3-year period. You know, definitely in the next application cycle, you know, build in as much as you can in terms of the need in your area and the justification of what your program is doing. At the federal level, if that's what the question is, like if we saw an increase in victimization of certain categories, it really does not tie into the process at all for the victim assistance awards, because they are just allocated by population based on what's left in the cap amounts.
All right, it looks like the questions have slowed down, so we can wrap up for today. Again, any questions that you have after this, please feel free to reach out. That's all I have, so we can go ahead and wrap up. Is there any last thoughts from the OVS team?
I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who stayed on here and who stayed on through all the numbers and everything. I know it's a lot and it's dense, but it is really important information. So we're happy to be able to share that with you, and always happy to talk about it more.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Take care.